When you think about it, the dial plan is the most basic, one of the best and most basic tools that we can use to harness the power of Asterisk. But that said, it's not necessarily the easiest programming logic that I've ever worked with. But when it's laid out well and commented liberally, the dial plan can really be a thing of beauty, considering what it can do for us. I run a relatively small software company that writes custom software solutions for customers around the United States. And to meet all their various requirements, we use several different programming languages. And frequently, we inherit code written by other programmers. Some of that code is very well written, well documented, easy to understand, and easy to maintain. Most of it, not so much. Well, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that no matter what programming language you're using, whether that be PHP, C#, VB, Java, or Asterisk for that matter, it's a whole lot easier to write bad code than it is to write good code. And that's true not just of other programmers, that's also true of ourselves, I think, as well, depending on what all is happening in our lives at a given point in time. If you could see some of the programs that we've inherited, however, you sometimes would just have to ask yourself, what in the world did this programmer have in mind? Well, it's fairly clear to see what they didn't have in mind, and that was a clear roadmap of where they were going. Most programmers that I've hired can't just sit down and whip something up. They need to sit down first and come up with a plan. Without a plan, even the best programmers will end up writing spaghetti code every time. A wise man once said, if you don't know where you are going, any road will get you there. And I will add that that road will have lots of twists and turns when there's no plan in place. And to demonstrate just how important this is, let's walk through a brief example of what invariably will happen when we fail to plan our dial plan. And then we'll look at some tools, at 4 tools we can use to stop the spaghetti. Please keep in mind that the primary goal of this talk is to discuss the structure and planning of our dial plan much more than it is to delve into the individual lines of syntax itself. So if I happen to breeze past individual lines of code and you'd like to ask something about it, feel free to stop me. But otherwise, just bear with me. There's a method to this madness. If you'd like a copy of anything that I'm presenting here today, also please see me afterward. Suppose a client of yours calls to tell you that they absolutely love the phone system that you just installed for them 3 weeks ago. But now, upper management at his company is wondering if they can start using DID numbers. So when a caller dials that first number, Asterisk automatically routes the call to Joe, and the second number should be routed directly to Sue, and so forth. Well, that's pretty simple, right? All we need to do is just add 5 lines of code to our dial plan, 1 for each DID. Now, assuming that these SIP extensions are valid, will this logic work? Well, yes, it will. As long as Joe and Sue and Mary and Tom and Barb are always sitting at their desks and they are staying off their phones as much as possible so that inbound calls can make their way through. But what if Joe is on another call? Or how about if the person calling is a salesperson who just won't take no for an answer? Or what happens when Sue works from home and wants to have her calls routed to a different number? Or how should Asterisk handle calls coming in on Thanksgiving or New Year's Day? It looks like we're going to need to flesh out these lines of code just a little bit more. For now, let's focus just on the first DID and how we can route those calls to Joe. And we'll tackle the remaining 4 DIDs a little bit later. For starters, let's talk about blacklist logic. First, what we can do is add a function to check whether we can find the caller ID of the call that's coming in the blacklist table that we've set up. If we do find the number in the blacklist, we'll play a message. and we'll dump the call into voicemail. And that's it. We've handled our first exception by just adding a few lines of code. Pretty straightforward, would you agree? Now, let's tackle call forwarding. Now, I realize that most SIP phones have call forwarding built right in, but that often means that someone is going to need to physically be in the office, standing by the phone, and ready to push buttons. They may have a web interface to that phone, but usually that's on an internal network as well. So why don't we just use a database so that we can manage call forwarding from a little website? It's not that difficult to set up. Of course, it will mean that our dial plan is going to need to take that into consideration. We're going to need to add just a few more lines of code. We start by looking up Joe's SIP extension in a database. And then we check whether Joe's extension is currently forwarded. Now, there are three possibilities that can happen here. First of all, Joe's extension might not be forwarded, in which case we can bypass the rest of the code and skip the other possibilities. Secondly, Joe's extension might be forwarded to an internal extension, and so we'll need to look up that SIP device. And third, Joe's extension might be forwarded to an outside number outside the building, and we'll take that into consideration as well. Now, we could add more exception handling, but you get the idea. Every time we do, we need to add more lines of code to our dial plan. Once we're done handling all the exceptions we need to, then we can go ahead and route the call. And we can route the call to voicemail if need be. So here is a snapshot of what the completed code to route Joe's calls to Joe's phone, wherever that might be, looks like. Now remember, these 33 lines of code only handle the first DID. We still need to accommodate 4 more. But now, imagine that it's 4:30 on Friday afternoon, and your customer calls, asking when you can deploy those DID enhancements he asked for. How about early on Monday morning before the office opens? It's 4:30 on Friday afternoon. How are we going to respond to the customer? Now, on the one hand, we could flat out tell the customer, no, it's simply not going to be ready. But what if we want to tell our customer yes? That means we're probably going to need to spend part of our weekend updating this logic so that it can accommodate all 5 DIDs. But what if we've already made plans for the weekend and we just don't have the time? We only have 30 minutes. Now, nobody in their right mind would think of copying and pasting these 33 lines and then just tweaking the numbers and the SIP extensions to protect the innocent now, would they? That would be absolutely insane. It would mean adding 165 lines of code to our dial plan. But hey, it'll be ready by Monday, and our customer will be delighted with our work, right? And none the wiser. He might be so delighted, in fact, that he might call again 3 weeks from now, asking us to add 15 more DIDs. Well, let's take a step back. How did we arrive at a point where our customer is asking us to set up DIDs only 3 weeks after deployment? Well, Dave, you say, you're the one who imagined this scenario, and that's true. But haven't we all seen situations like this, where scope creep jams its foot into the door right in the middle of a phone system migration or shortly thereafter? And why is that? Maybe it's because our customers don't realize what a powerful arsenal of tools Asterisk can bring to the table. Or maybe it's because salespeople tend to be so eager to win the sale that they don't ask enough questions up front. And unfortunately, sometimes maybe we're the salespeople. And that's why at our company we developed a comprehensive questionnaire so that we can find out what our customers' needs are, and so that we can make sure that our customer has a complete understanding of what it is that we can bring to them. Now, the questionnaire that we've developed is 13 pages long. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend just plopping it on the customer's desk and expecting them to fill it out. It really serves more as a script for interviewing the customer, maybe over a series of several different meetings, so that we can learn about our customers' needs and maybe even upsell some of the services we have to offer. The questionnaire covers a lot of ground, and so we aren't going to have a lot of time to look at individual questions in detail. But here's a quick overview of the section headings. By the way, if you'd like to get a copy, just see me after this session. We start by asking about the phone system that's currently in place, what the customer likes, and what they don't like. And then we ask about satellite offices and telecommuters. Then come questions about the existing phone equipment. And we're asking that partly so we can determine whether or not the phone equipment that's in place can be reused after migrating to the new PBX. Then come questions about how the system currently functions, what they like about it, and improvements that they'd like to see. We also ask questions about the existing wiring, the types of phone lines that are in place, and the local area network configuration. We go on to ask about the user experience, asking about how calls are routed as they come into the system. And then we ask about how calls are routed in the office between extensions and maybe between satellite offices. And we also ask about outbound functionality. Then we go on to ask about voicemail and their experience with it. To make sure that we've covered all of our bases, we also include pages for our customers to describe each phone line, as well as a page for the customer to list the individual telephone sets that they might want to reuse in the new system. Now, for larger customers, we've also included these last 2 pages as spreadsheets so that they can hopefully fill them out on a computer and so that we can hopefully import that data into a database. Once we have all the data that we need, the next step is to create a visual roadmap to segregate all those moving parts and pieces into their appropriate pigeonholes. And one useful tool that we found very helpful to help us to visualize where we're going is a block diagram. And here's an example. Now, these diagrams, I've found, tend to vary quite a bit depending on the nature of the system that the customer is asking for. So it's not a case of one size fits all. But you don't necessarily need fancy software to set these up. A whiteboard works just fine, or even a legal pad. But when you're working with a system that can become very complex, it's helpful to set down a visual summary of how all the individual pieces and parts will fit together in the dial plan. In this case, I've broken out the functionality into 3 main sections based on the direction of the call. One is devoted to inbound traffic, one to internal traffic, and one for outbound traffic. And each of the individual bullet points here will help us to build out our dial plan into sections, into logical order, that will serve, and they'll also serve as a checklist for testing later on. Now, as we prepare to write the actual code for our dial plan, we'll rely back on this diagram as the basis to flesh out the individual functionality in much more detail. And from this point, you can use flowcharts, you can write pseudocode, whatever it takes to flesh out each of these items in much more detail. For example, the auto attendant is going to take a few lines of thought that really doesn't fit very well into a broad overview. But these bullet points can be very helpful in serving as a point of reference for the code that we write going forward. Now let's think back to our 4:30 on Friday scenario. If we had made use of a questionnaire up front and mapped out the system using a block diagram with the answers, we may have prevented the DID, we may have planned DID routing into our dial plan before we even wrote the first line of code. And one of the best tools that we've found that helps to avoid bloated dial plans is the gosub command. Gosub allows us to abstract our code. It allows us to create reusable functions. It lets us pass in various arguments and then return a value or maybe branch to a different section of logic. Leveraging gosubs allows us to write smarter code, usually ending up a whole lot shorter with fewer lines to maintain and a lot less code to debug when we're done. My goal when writing a dial plan is to create many, many, many small gosubs, one for each individual task, or one to return one answer, which we can call from anywhere in the dial plan. They become essentially black boxes. So once that gosub logic has been tested, you can call it from anywhere and you know that that logic is going to work every time. So if we refer back to our block diagram for a moment, each of the bullet points here might be good candidates for creating one or many gosubs. Let's look at an example of how we can incorporate gosubs into our dial plan. Most companies will not allow their users, their employees, to dial 900 numbers. But did you know that there also are a number of other area codes in the North American numbering plan that aren't located in the continental US, but can cost an arm and a leg to dial? Now, if we want to avoid those charges, we can write a gosub routine to handle those specific area codes. So first, we extract the area code from the number that's being dialed, and then we call a gosub to check whether the number is in our band area codes database. If it is, we tell the caller that that number is restricted, and then we use another gosub to say goodbye and hang up. If the area code is not banned, then we'll just return control back to the dial plan and call another gosub to actually dial the number. So gosubs are an extremely powerful tool that we need to include in our arsenal. And last, but certainly not least, the fourth tool that we can use to streamline our dial plan is a database. And whether that be SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MySQL, or any number of other databases, Asterisk has ODBC connectors pretty much for all of them that can get you connected into the database fairly easily. The book, Asterisk, The Definitive Guide, has a chapter chock full of instructions on how to set this up, and I'd encourage you to read it. I cannot stress enough the power of incorporating a database into the dial plan. Databases give you incredible power to organize your data, turning this into this. And referencing them from the dial plan can be an extremely efficient way to reduce the number of lines of code that you're going to write. Again, I cannot stress enough the power of incorporating a database into the dial plan. Because when dial plans start talking to a database, they end up reducing the number of lines of code you need. Many of those sections, for example, that used to contain multiple go-to if lines will typically go away. And I found that by using a database, I don't have to tweak the dial plan as often and then worry about breaking it, because I can just add or remove lines or records to the database instead. Databases open up a whole new world of possibilities for your dial plan. And if you know how to create stored procedures, or if you learn how to create stored procedures in your database, you can offload even more lines of code from your dial plan into the stored procedure that otherwise would have required quite a bit more time, or quite a bit more programming to do inside of Asterisk. And plus, if you know a little bit of PHP, you can set up a website so that users can manage these tables themselves from anywhere. I'm sold on databases, and I hope you are too. When done right, planning out a dial plan is going to take a fair amount of time and forethought. But putting in that time up front will pay dividends for many years to come.